Welcome back, everybody. This is our keynote speech session, and we have with us Senator Lewis Blessing and a panel of people. I'm going to introduce Senator Blessing first. Senator Blessing is in the Ohio Senate. His district covers the Cincinnati, parts of the Cincinnati and Hamilton County area. Senator Blessing is the chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. He's also on the new Senate Select Housing Committee. And I would say from the interactions I've had with him over the last 6 months, he's really emerged as one of the leading voices expressing concern about investors coming from out of state and the lack of affordable housing opportunities as investors are paying cash to buy homes that otherwise could provide housing opportunities. And Senator Blessing has introduced a number of bills and is continuing to work on bills to address these issues. The panel following Senator Blessing will be Sally Martin O'Toole, Director of Building and Housing for the City of Cleveland, Patrick Grogan Myers, Director of Planning and Development for the City of Euclid, Henry Studemeyer, President of McMullen Realty. And I should mention that Henry's in a family we have 3 generations who've been working on the east side of Cleveland. And then last, we'll have Bill Gruber, who's the Director of Law for the City of Shaker Heights. Senator Blessing will talk for about 20 minutes. The panel will then have 20 minutes to interact with Senator Blessing and express their thoughts. And then we hope to have 15 minutes left. And as you're proceeding with this, please put your questions in the chat, and then we'll get to those in the order that they come in. So Senator Blessing, without any further delay, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Frank. I know that I lost a little bit of time here, but I'll dive right into it. There's 2 pieces of legislation that I'm working on to stop the predatory investing, I guess, as I would call it. And as many of you know, these aren't your mom and pop investors. These are, large private equity firms. These are, bankrolled by pension funds. The state of Ohio, I think, is through our various pension funds invested to the tune of $200 million into some of these entities. And the way that I have sought to curb these is it started with a piece of legislation that came out of California that is now Senate Bill 36. And if you'll recall from the great financial recession, there were a lot of foreclosures, a lot of people losing their homes, and they were able to buy up a lot of these homes in bulk, which they then turned around into these rentals, just started building their rental empire. And what that legislation does, Senate Bill 36, is to say, no, there's a first right of refusal. So the foreclosure auction process proceeds the way it does now. The difference is that if the winning bid is, let's say it's an investor, and there are people that wish to bid on it that are, currently the tenant, or maybe somebody that wants to own or occupy it, or perhaps a nonprofit involved with housing or even a political subdivision, they have the ability to match or slightly exceed the bid and take the property, as opposed to the one who actually won the bid. And I think this would be a great tool for local governments, homeowners, current tenants may want to own, to actually become homeowners. And I also would argue it's a prophylactic measure from the standpoint if we run into a housing crisis or collapse or something to that effect again, we're not going to wind up in the same situation where these folks are able to come in there and scoop up homes in bulk again. So hopefully something like that doesn't happen, but in all cases I think legislation like this would be good, not just from the institutional investor standpoint, but also from the standpoint if you're, say, a housing provider for those with developmental disabilities, you're able to get homes, on the cheap. And granted, you'd have to rework them, obviously, to work with your clients. But you'd be able to get homes that are actually in the community, so these people can live in the community and more fully experience that sort of housing environment as opposed to an institution. The second piece of legislation I'm very proud of, and this was a bipartisan effort with a number of various housing groups, as well as county auditors and folks like that, and that is Senate Bill 76. And the best way to describe this is think of it as an antitrust bill. It's not meant to go after local landlords, particularly the small ones. This is meant to knock out a simple problem, which is the large institutional housing investors. And the way that it works is, let's suppose, and I should make a caveat to this, this does not affect quads. It does not affect commercial real estate like apartments. It doesn't affect nonprofits. This is only 1, 2, and 3 unit single family homes. So let's suppose that you are an investor that owns north of 50 homes in a single county. We'll use the example of a large investor in Hamilton County that owns, based on various estimates, anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 single family homes in that single county. What it does is it levies a tax of $1,500 per month per property. And so if you think about that, if you own 3,000 homes in that county, that would come to 1,500 times 12 is 18,000 times those 3,000 homes. You're looking at a tax of $54 million in a given year. Now, the key, and this absolutely is key, is that nobody is going to pay that tax. Nobody. You can look at the fiscal note, and obviously the LSE economists have agreed with this assessment as well. What will happen is that they will liquidate their portfolio. Not all of it necessarily, but a good chunk of it, to avoid paying that tax, because it's not something that they can pass on. If you think of rent being, let's say, if it's not rent restricted, market rate rental, somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 per month. Could you really pass on $1,500 per month? The answer is, of course not. That would put the rents over $3,000. They have to compete with other smaller landlords. They simply can't do it, and they would have to leave the market. So I think it's a great, innovative way to get around that problem. But there's another piece to this, and this is the transparency piece. And I'm sure a lot of you have had to deal with this problem of trying to find out who owns what. And this same investor in Hamilton County, they operate through a series of, I think it was 90 plus LLCs. And, they'll buy and sell LLCs. The auditors have, little to no clue as to, who owns what in these cases without having to do a significant amount of work. This bill creates a method to force these folks to divulge who they actually are, who the common owners are. And the way that it does it, it says that from the standpoint of a taxpayer, if you have more than a 50% ownership stake in any LLC, for the purposes of paying taxes, you have to pay them as a common taxpayer. So even though these LLCs are in theory distinct, all the homes that they own in that portfolio have to be treated under, the law as a common taxpayer. And they have to give a lot more information with respect to these LLCs and who's behind them. The penalty for not complying with that is a felony 5 and a $750,000 fine. In addition, if you don't pay your taxes on some of the homes that you own, you get hit with a fine of 5% of the median home price in Ohio, which is something like $200-some thousand, which would amount to, I think it's like 10 grand per home. So the penalty is pretty significant, if they're going to try to avoid compliance. But again, I think what would happen is that they would liquidate their holdings, and those homes would go onto the market. And to be frank, I think there's a good number of investors, smaller investors, local landlords, that would buy these homes, as well as homeowners. But Here is another key with this too. When we talk about high home prices, you have, homes that are for rent, for example, and homes that are for sale. When these guys buy up homes in mass in any given area, they greatly spike the demand at the same time that the supply can't be increased. So they really do have a major impact on driving up home prices. But there's another insidious factor to this, in that when you basically have a monopoly on these single family rental homes, there's no competition. You own all these homes, you know what all the rents are going to be. You have no incentive to compete, and therefore no incentive to lower rents. And this is something that would actually be illegal if it were a handful of landlords trying to get together to price fix. And we can look to Texas. There's a lawsuit there surrounding RealPage, where RealPage, gets a measure of what the rents are, and these folks were involved. And if you know what everybody else is renting for, it's where's the competition? And that's the neat part about this bill. If it were to go in place, it would guarantee there are no enormous monopolistic institutional landlords in place, and you would have a larger ecosystem of these smaller landlords who would have to then compete against each other for tenants, thereby keeping rents low. So I think all of the incentives are in place for this. But that said, what can we get through the General Assembly is the question at hand. And there have been talk of, well, 50 homes is too small. Maybe it should be higher. I had originally thought 350 would actually work, just because I knew that it could drive out the large private equity guys, which is really who I sought out to get rid of. But be that as it may, I ran into trouble on committee and with many of my colleagues in my caucus that just don't want to see, or don't want to be tied to some sort of tax increase, or at least what they think of as a tax increase, even though that's not what's going on. And or they may view this as I don't want to go against the free market. If somebody wants to own 1,000 homes, that's fine for them. I deeply disagree with that sentiment, obviously, but that's how they feel, and those are the folks that I have to work with on this. So, and I would point out, it's actually not a free market. We have a number of tax incentives that go to, landlords of all sizes. So it's like, well, if you're really serious about the free market, you might want to look at getting rid of some of those things. So the approach that I have taken at this point with Senate Bill 76, and there are some, tweaks to the transparency piece that we can make as well. But I think what I'm going to do is get rid of the tax piece of this and go with what I think can work. And the pitch is this. Listening to some of the folks from Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, there are a lot of complaints about these guys not paying their fines, not addressing any of these building code violations, just being very problematic landlords. So there are a number of incentives that I had mentioned about that the state of Ohio gives out for landlords to take advantage of. The idea would be is, okay, you have to comply with the transparency piece. In addition, if you want to continue getting any form of state tax incentive for your rental operation, then you have to fix the building code violations. You have to pay the fines. You have to be working well with the local governments. Otherwise, you will lose. Let's see here. You'll lose the non-business credit, which is the 10% property tax rollback on the homes that you may be renting out. You would lose the business income deduction, which you can take advantage of for rental income if that's your primary business. You would lose the ability to get a property tax exemption through a community reinvestment area, for example, which could be quite costly to them if they're taking advantage of that. And frankly, I would also do something along the lines of, if you're getting some form of an abatement and you're not being a good team player, even if it's a local abatement, you're not going to get that anymore. So I think by pulling back all of these incentives, which I would argue we should have done this years ago, I think I can get some of my colleagues on board. I know, at least talking to a Cleveland area senator, Senator Serino, that he's much, much more amenable to that. And to be clear, my colleagues are fine with the transparency piece of this. They agree that, something in that vein needs to be done. So that's where I'm going to go with this. Is it perfect? Does it knock these guys out of the space? Probably not, but it forces them to provide in theory, it provides them to provide a good product, good, clean housing, free of building code violations, and they're going to start paying their fines. And I think at a minimum, this is a good first step. And frankly, I feel a little guilty, because I really like Senate Bill 76 as it is. But down in Cincinnati, we had Erica Fayborg with the Cincinnati's legal department just saying, look, at this point, we need transparency more than anything else. And, I'm like, you know what, let me just put this aside and get that done, even if it's not perfect. That is absolutely worth it. So that is where we are with, those two pieces of legislation. And yeah, I think the timeline is, we have limited numbers of sessions going forward, but this isn't something that I don't think we can get. I think we can get this done maybe springish, at least out of the Senate. That should tee us up well at a minimum for lame duck. I know it's tricky with this being an election year and whatnot, but no, I really am hopeful, and I know that it obviously has bipartisan support. Cleveland way, my joint sponsor is Senator Nikki Antonio, leading the Democratic caucus. I suspect that we get this in good shape. All the Democrats would be on board, in the Senate and the House, which, that puts us in a position where we can get something moving going forward. So with that,
all right.
Shut up.
Thank you, Senator Blessing. Before I turn it over to the panelists, I have one quick question. And I'm very pleased to hear that there's bipartisan support for the transparency piece. Would that even extend to the idea of, I hadn't heard this before, but the idea of attaching a felony for failure to comply? That's really powerful. Do you think that has bipartisan support as well?
It's a good question. It's already in the bill.
Okay.
So my guess is yes, because okay. My worry in all cases is, talking to my colleagues, and for what it's worth, they didn't really push back too much, in the sense that, guys, you can't have a $50 fine for something like this. Yeah. There has to be some teeth to it. Right. And a felony 5 would do it. Frankly, $750,000 as far as a fine would be, meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Some of these big guys, the entity down in Hamilton County is bankrolled by some extremely, powerful and wealthy fund managers. So, but that felony 5, I think, makes a difference. And I think losing a lot of their incentives that make that business case work, I think makes this transparency piece definitely doable.
Okay, thank you. So I think we're going to bring the panel in so that they're all visible, I think. Or maybe are we just doing one at a time? Oh, no, here we go. We're getting everybody. I think we need one more. Bill. Okay, so the first person up will be Director Sally Martin O'Toole with the City of Cleveland's Building and Housing Department. Sally, you've got the floor.
Thank you. Senator, we're so pleased that you see the enormity of the crisis that we're dealing with here in Cuyahoga County, and that you're doing what you can to address it. And I can't tell you how appreciative I am that we see some bipartisan support here, especially with transparency. So one of the things in Cleveland, and I know earlier on this forum we discussed, was at 54% of the properties on the east side of Cleveland are going to business buyers. We've lost 30% of our home ownership on the east side of Cleveland. It's a crisis. And the more we can collaborate with the state, the better off we're going to be. And so City of Cleveland is putting forward a very progressive suite of legislative changes. Also in the same regard, one of them is to require local agents in charge for any owner that lives outside of the county that holds rental properties. So the other thing to note here in Cleveland too is just the amount of lead poisoning, 40% greater than the national average. So we don't see the level of maintenance with outside owners that we do, with a mom and pop that's really trying to comply, that we can get into court. So this transparency piece is a game changer, and we do appreciate it. But the more we can all work together, I think the better off we're going to be. It's just been incredibly difficult to hold these buyers accountable. They're very slippery. They have attorneys that if we do get them, if we somehow miraculously perfect service on them, they evade, they file appeals. We're really needing new tools in the toolbox, which is what our Residents First legislative package is hoping to do. So we're looking at a Q1, hopefully passage of that. We're hoping our council will be supportive. We worked with many of our city council members. We worked with internal staff. We worked with our friends at VAPAC to develop what we feel are best practice pieces of legislation. And it's interesting because we were working with Erica Freiburg also. We were at the Vacant Property Leadership Institute with her and really looking at what Cincinnati is doing and doing a lot of collaboration throughout the state, which I think is what's needed now. We can't do this in a vacuum. We all have to work together. So with that, I'll yield the floor because I know that we're going to have a robust dialogue all between us, and I'm sure there will be so many questions.
Thank you, Sally. Patrick, you're next.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Senator Blessing, again, for your work on this as well. I echo Director Martin O'Toole's comments. It's wonderful to have partners who, regardless of affiliation, see the challenge that we face as Ohioans. And I think that's the big focus point. Just for everyone else on the call, just as a brief bit of background. So in the Planning and Development Department in the city of Euclid, we oversee multiple functions, but that includes more than $1 million in annual CDBG allocation, which I know has been so critical to the work that we've done here in Cuyahoga County and in so many of our communities. And previously to serving in the city of Euclid, I've served in University Heights and Maple Heights. So I have this unique background working on the east side and inner ring suburbs. And I had planned to come today with this whole suite of statistics to help kind of bring to light this conversation as it applies to Euclid. But I think, Frank, you did a wonderful job earlier in our conference today, really getting into some of the problems and highlighting those, as you've always done in your commitment to looking at the statistics on this. So I think from my perspective, I just wanted to bring real quick to this conversation a focus on the people who sit behind these numbers, the people who we serve as local government officials. And one thing I want to stress is I think that to have a well-functioning local housing market, we need good investors to help in providing housing, because not everyone wants to own a home or is ready to own a home yet or can afford a home yet. And so we need to provide that housing and make sure it's quality housing. So Senator Blessing, I think your legislation works to do just that and help us to enforce that. I think a common thread in my time in government, certainly I've worked in now 2 majority minority communities. And what I've seen is that the majority minority neighborhoods within each community bared the brunt in the 2008 foreclosure crisis, with households losing equity at horrific rates. And in some cases, losing homes altogether because of predatory lending practices, and certainly just the market forces that came to bear. These neighborhoods also are still bearing the brunt of that foreclosure crisis from out-of-state and out-of-country landlords who do not invest in their properties. We saw all those webinars and YouTube videos and conferences at airport conference rooms saying, here's how to get your mailbox money. The neighborhoods are still bearing the consequences of that 13 plus years later. And that's still those out of state and out of country landlords who are not responding to tenant complaints about poor conditions. And they're still bearing the brunt today, being underwater and unable to get home repair loans. We see that in the results around Cuyahoga County, where many cities have dedicated general funds or other dollars to make home repair grants to help homeowners make the needed home repairs in their respective communities. And certainly in Cuyahoga County, our housing stock continues to get older. We're not replacing the housing stock in a meaningful way, as we talked about earlier on this conference call. So one neighborhood, I just wanted to dive into one particular neighborhood real quick. There's a neighborhood we have here in Euclid where we are investing $270,000 alone in helping residents who shared their growing need for home repairs and unable to get and make home repair loans. In one case, we had an 81-year-old woman who had to get a part-time job to make home repairs before we started our grant program this year. And certainly we're barely making a dent at $270,000. In another case, we had a husband and wife who talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. They work solid jobs. They have incomes that are just above the income limits for means-tested grant assistance, but they're not making enough money to go get that conventional loan to make those home repairs. And we see this come through because in this particular neighborhood, investor owners are still paying less, depending on the year, between 14 and 26% less than owner occupants for their properties. And they're paying cash, so they can beat out that owner occupant in so many transactions. And that's keeping values down in the neighborhood. And this is a critical component to our work as we look to the long-term recovery for this particular neighborhood, when investors account for anywhere between 28 and 50% of the annual property sales. So it's absolutely a very real issue as we take calls from homeowners who are desperate for assistance, who are desperate for their landlord to come in and make repairs. So I could go on and share these things, and certainly I want to turn it back over to the panel. But I think key to all of this work are partnerships. And it's been consistent, whether it's neighborhood associations, it's working with the Heritage Home Program and the Cleveland Restoration Society, it's working with our local CDC, it's working with Akron-Cleveland Association of Realtors, and many more. It takes a true long-term commitment at the county and the statewide level to do more and to do better. So thank you again, Senator Blessing. I'll turn it back over to the panel.
Thank you, Patrick. Henry, welcome and happy to have you as always. You have the floor.
Senator Blessing, we thank you for giving us some of your time. We know it's quite valuable. And I think this information that we're discussing is very important to the state, and especially to Northeast Ohio and Cleveland in particular. I've been selling real estate since 1979. And when you see what some investors, as you have outlined, have done to certain neighborhoods or streets, it's egregious. You can see when there's a homeowner present and the love they put into their home compared to blocks of tenancy, and the housing stock looks abysmal. I've met a very super dynamic lady, probably not quite a dozen years ago, Sally Martin O'Toole. There was a piece of property that a homeowner wanted to buy. However, the large conglomerate says, no, we're going to sell it to an investor. I didn't know Sally at that time, but I reached out to her and said, wait a minute, this large conglomerate's about to give it to an investor. What can you do to help? Well, she became super because she went against the conglomerate and went for the homeowner. She is Super Sally. Many folks don't do that. They buckle their knees and give in, but not Sally. We need more Sallys in this world. What does that do when we have someone like a Super Sally? Well, this man has been in a home for these years. He probably wouldn't have got that home if it wasn't for Sally. It's important. Every person to me, and even Super Sally, is important because we're looking at people. I know we got Frank. He's a great statistic person. We love you, Frank. But day to day, I'm on these streets looking at what those statistics mean in real life people, they're being adversely affected, folks. There's a person who wanted to buy a house in Lee Harvard, only $99,000. Great first-time buyer house. But then I got a call from 2 investors who want to buy the same house but get cash. So Frank, I had to race to get that first-time buyer's offer accepted because these investors saw an opportunity. Will they end up being the kind of investors that will not take care of the property or put people in there who may not take care of the property? I don't know. But we have to look forward to home ownership and trying to promote individuals for equal access to these homes for sale. We got too many problems in large buildings where we can't find owners of these large buildings. People don't have working elevators. They don't have heat. Temperature's low now. In this county, we're talking about 30 and 40 degrees. How do you explain to someone we can't even find an owner? They don't want to hear that. And then they turn on electric heaters and their electric bill, the meter starts spinning and spinning and spinning. It makes for a vicious cycle for those who can least afford higher utility bills because we can't find owners to take care of the buildings that they bought. And they are large conglomerates. And I know it's hard for the city, all these cities, to find these owners. But whatever you can do, Senator, you got our vote, because we need people to be held accountable, especially these large conglomerations. And finally, when we look at these individuals like this lady, she's a postal worker, wanted to buy a first home. I directed her to the city of Cleveland, right in Lee Harvard. She wanted to go to the suburbs. But I said, but the city has many things to offer. She was disillusioned. But she heard what I said, and she bought in the city of Cleveland, right in Lee Harvard. What's the benefit? Well, trying to get her financing, I had to use a mortgage broker because the city couldn't, all the large banks didn't want to finance her. We only tried twice, but a mortgage broker took her on. The banks have to be held accountable. They have these super large deposits, but they don't give back to constituents. The massive church groups and their leaders are very frustrated that their constituents can't get loans from the large banks. They offer great programs. But what good is a great program if you can't have access to mortgage money through the large banks? And I know with all of us working together, as Patrick says, a group effort, we can change some of these dynamics that are having serious negative impacts upon real people. We all need to work together to get this accomplished. We want to see some transformation in Northeast Ohio and throughout the state. Whatever happens to the nice young older people who bought this house, they fixed it up, they paid their mortgage on time, then all of a sudden, because of age, they may die, and the kids can't even afford it, but they abandon it. I've never seen something so crazy in my life. And so, you have another vacant house on streets that could at least afford all these vacant properties. And it makes it hard on our council people, Sally. How do you keep up with all these vacant homes and all these streets? And you see, some neighbors will cut the grass next door. Many will not. And it causes even more blight in the city. Well, I hope we can get some answers to just few of these quadria problems that affect just first-time buyers and people who've been living in their homes for many years. I look forward to it. Maybe the next 10 years for young people like Patrick will be better for us old folks who've been doing this for 30 and 40 years. It won't happen, folks, if we don't work together. We have to work together to get this a reality. Because if we don't, the statistics that Frank keeps talking about, how they still declining, can't get repair money, can't get first money mortgage from the city of Cleveland. And Senator, it's not just Cleveland, it's all these major cities throughout Ohio. large banks just don't want to lend to people of color. They just don't. Why? I don't know. They used to 20 and 30 years ago. They just stopped doing it. It's good for business to put good people in homes, but we got to make these banks accountable. I can't blame the loan officers. I blame the chairman of the board and that board of directors for not directing attention to getting the mortgage money out into the communities. Your help is needed, Senator. We don't want to keep you up all night, but your help is definitely needed.
Thank you, Henry. Appreciate your thoughts. And yeah, data is good, but data isn't quite as good as the personal stories that people can share like you just did. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Bill. Bill, you've got the floor.
Thank you. And thanks, Senator Blessing, for your efforts. And it's a tough act to follow all these panelists coming in last. But so I'll just take a couple minutes to focus on a couple issues that are important and have been to me over the years, and also our city and our officials here. So anybody who works in the housing area knows that the buying and selling of real estate anonymously in Ohio has been the rule. Anonymous real estate transactions is ubiquitous throughout the state. So I appreciate the transparency provisions in SB 76, both applying them to houses transferred by or to a pass-through entity, and also ownership interest transfers, because that's an important issue too that it does not get addressed. The provisions in 76 start to get at the recurring and long-standing problem in Ohio that we deal with constantly, of entities, local, out of county, out of state, and out of country, buying properties, and we have no information about who is behind the entity or who is the responsible party. And the transfers of entities that own properties without an actual change of ownership via a recorded deed. And that's very common now, which makes getting contact information for a responsible party even more difficult. We've been fighting here for years over this issue. I know a number of cities like ours have tied some of our requirements, like rental licenses, to being registered with the Secretary of State. I was disappointed to learn that recently, a new law took effect in 2022, revising completely the Limited Liability Company Act. So if any of your ordinances, by the way, refer to 1705, make sure you update those to 1706 now, because 1705 doesn't exist anymore in the Ohio Revised Code. But that law, for the first time, as far as I can tell, exempts foreign corporations. That means any corporation from outside Ohio, limited liability companies, from registering if they simply own real estate in Ohio. So the ownership of real estate does not require registration for foreign corporations. It does for in-state corporations and limited liability companies, but for some reason, foreign corporations have been given a pass. Now, whether that will be interpreted to mean that it doesn't apply if a foreign LLC rents the property and conducts business that way, I don't know. But if it's just a flipper who buys and sells property, they may no longer need to register with the Secretary of State. So I think that's not a good sign that provision got into that law that was passed just in 2021. We need more information, not less, with LLCs and the Ohio Secretary of State. So we need changes to state law to tighten the laws for registration, increasing the penalties, expanding the authority of the Secretary of State, granting jurisdiction to local directors of law like myself and prosecutors to pursue civil and criminal penalties for failure to register with the Secretary of State. We have tried over the years many times with secretaries of states of different parties to push them to enforce the laws. And it's difficult because the penalties are very low, and there's very little repercussion for failing to register, failing to maintain an updated statutory agent. Also, no county recorder should be allowed to accept a deed for recording that includes a business entity as one of the parties, unless that they provide proof that it's registered with the Secretary of State, and that they provide information as to who's behind the the LLC. And maybe we can start chipping away at this anonymous real estate ownership. And just last point is I think it's great to apply these to single, 2, and 3 family houses. I think it should also apply to apartment buildings, these transparency laws, but we'll take what we can get right now, but I think we need to look at the bigger picture too. So thanks very much, everyone, for giving me an opportunity today.
Thank you, Bill. Let's see. So I had a note from the person who's coordinating this session that we, as you may have known, we were going to end at 1, which would leave us only 10 minutes. And we had planned to leave 15 for questions from the audience. I've been told that we can actually go a little bit beyond our 1 o'clock deadline. So we'll still do the questions from the audience, but I have one thing I wanted to put out for everyone's consideration before I go to the chat. It's something I think I've discussed with Senator Blessing, and I did testify at his Ways and Means Committee last year. I think in the greater Cleveland market, we seem to have not as many of the mega institutional investors. And I'm going to posing this question to everyone to think about. And so instead of positioning it as mega investors and mom and pop, I think there's something in the middle, and they may own less than 50. I think from the, sorry to rely upon data here, but some of the research I've done would suggest that there are a number of problem owners that are somehow a notch above the mom and pop, and they're owning 30, 40, 50 that might still be under the threshold that we consider an institutional investor. And the second thing I want to put on the table for discussion, it's just another way of looking at the market here. I think what we're seeing is a different type of investor surfacing, and that's an investor who actually doesn't take title. I know that may seem contradictory, but we have small property management, or relatively small local property management companies who are converting themselves into being brokers of, they will recruit investors from California, Utah, Israel, France, wherever, and say, we'll take care of everything for you. And so they end up touching thousands of properties, but they don't own any of them. And we have these owners who may be in Texas or wherever, and they may only 10 or 12, 15 properties. And so I guess I wanted to put it all on the table for consideration as to what do we mean by investors? What are people seeing? And feel free, anybody who wants to jump in, Senator Blessing and any of the panelists on that.
So Frank, just real quick point, we've seen that, and also where each individual investor is an owner of a property.
Okay.
So you dealt with I remember talking to a person in Toronto, an elderly woman and her husband who had no idea that they had title to a property in Shaker Heights because they invested in a company that's a real estate investment firm, and they didn't know that that investment firm was putting each individual property in the name of one of their investors.
Interesting.
And, so they were shocked to find out that we were trying to criminally prosecute them for housing violations.
Yeah. Any other thoughts from any other? And Senator, please.
No, geez, that is a very vexing problem. Bill, if you could, because I mean, you went through a lot of points. If you could email those to my office along with your thoughts on this, I'd like to look into that further. I mean, I lean on a couple of county auditors to help with what they need going after these guys. And to give you an example, you know, even though the bill says, Senate Bill 76 says 50% ownership stake, you know, some of these folks have said, well, you know, the majority, like the largest owner might only have like a 15% stake in the, you know, in the investment property. So there's that. There were a number of other things that are starting to pop up that we would like to add in there. So if you have some thoughts, that's great. I will also reach out to LSC to sort of brainstorm with them to figure that out. But I mean, that's vexing. I don't know how to go about that. Although thinking back to, you know, some of the things that were mentioned earlier, I do like the idea of now tying more things to state benefits. So I had mentioned, and the non-business credit and things like that. Maybe also saying that if you still want those benefits and you take control of a property, then you're going to have to do something with respect to lead abatement, which why not? The state's not under, again, any obligation to give out any money unless things are being done right. So, and I think my colleagues might go for something like that. But anyway, yeah, this I'm not an expert as much in this area. I will definitely need help, Bill.
Thank you. So there's one question in the chat. We might end up wrapping up close to being 1 o'clock anyway. The one question is, could the transparency concept apply beyond residential to commercial and industrial properties? And it was raised by Tony Brancatelli, former councilman in Slavic Village, where I know they've had a lot of small industry and commercial properties. But so, Senator, has that been raised? Is that something that could be considered?
Yeah, absolutely. It could be considered. I mean, it hasn't been raised. The only reason it hasn't come up is because I was trying to, go after a very narrow problem.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the only reason something like that wasn't included, but I'm happy to do something like that. And I again, one of those, transparency, I think, is something that does get broad bipartisan support.
Well, and I will add, just because other people may not have heard this, but when I testified at your Ways and Means Committee, and I remember several of your colleagues saying, isn't this a local problem? Why are we getting involved in a local problem with these investors? And my response was, that's fine. We would be happy to take care of it locally, but we can't find them. And that got the attention of some of your colleagues on the committee. So I think it's really good that the idea resonates that give us the tools, and local municipalities with those tools can try to do more to hold these investors accountable.
I want to throw in too, Senator, thank you for the offer of an opportunity to send you my thoughts. But another area, if you're looking at if you to take away potentially benefits for property owners, especially rental business owners, make sure they're paying their property taxes, because many of these often just stop paying their property taxes, and they'll wait till the very last second before they're foreclosed on, even after it's filed, to then pay off their taxes sometimes. And so that really hurts everybody. So, that's, if you talk about the homeowner in these neighborhoods who's paying their property taxes and it's difficult, but then the next door neighbor, is an LLC from California and they're not paying their property taxes. That's a problem, and that's not fair.
So what a coincidence. Senate Bill 186, I introduced that with Senator Catherine Ingram, good Lord, past couple weeks. And what that does is it says you can't split property, transfer property, purchase tax foreclosed property unless you've paid your property taxes. So I think that's a great starting point to do some of the things that you're talking about. And the good news with that is that, Senate Bill 76, started more organically, in the sense that, I was working on this behind the scenes to solve a local problem. This particular issue was brought to me by the county the County Treasurers Association. So now there's, some pretty significant backing for something like that. So, yeah, I totally agree. And I saw somebody in the chat mention water and sewer bills. Absolutely. I mean, you should not be able to be, getting a free pass on these sorts of things. So I agree with that.
And the only thing I'd chime in on is, I think one of the threads that I'm picking up throughout all of today, that I think this panel really captures, is thinking about what are the negative externalities of bad investors, right? Part of what makes the pro forma work for a bad investor is the non-payment of property taxes, is the non-payment of water and sewer bills. It's skirting those things which otherwise good investors and good homeowners do, investing in the property, maintaining the property, even when it's painful to write that $12,000 to $15,000 check for a new roof. It's the long-term commitment to this is where I'm going to live, or this is a good investment. And something that just comes out of it is I'll think of it from the local government side, just given my perspective, but what is it costing us to essentially subsidize, to internalize those negative externalities? And how do we stop that, right? I mean, we're now creating grant programs. We're looking for funding partners to help with loans. And certainly some of that needs to exist outside of this conversation, but also there's a call to step up and fill these gaps that are created by negative externalities that are not being internalized by bad investors. And that system that allows them to get away with that, I think figuring out how to put a stop to that is the focus point of this conversation. And Senator Blessing, I think so much of what you're talking about is working towards that, and just requiring accountability.
I just like
Please.
I just like to add, with apartment buildings specifically, what the city of Cleveland's been going through for the past many years. Multi-unit buildings are increasingly being owned by out-of-state investors who are not putting any money into the properties. And so we're getting no heat calls on a daily basis. We're getting, broken elevator calls. We have seniors living on the 8th floor of a building. They can't get down to get medicine. They can't get to doctor's appointments. And so we asked City Council about a month ago for a funding stream to do nuisance abatement where we can go in and fix the elevator and fix the boiler. And obviously this is not a sustainable solution. So creating, what you're trying to do, Senator Blessing, with more transparency and accountability, especially around things like, you have to pay your property taxes and we need to know who you are, will go a long way. And I think really help some of our local efforts. So again, we're so grateful for you.
And I have a question for you, Senator, just to clarify something that came up earlier with regard to the felony fine and the possible up to $750,000 felony charge for noncompliance with transparency and the $750,000 possible fine. Was that in the new version? Is that connected to transparency, or was it originally just connected to the failure to pay for the financial?
That's connected to transparency.
It is. Good. Thank you very much. Okay. Looks like the last question might be regarding it's from Ron O'Leary. VAPAC has discussed changing the revised code so that property transfers are complete upon filing the deed with the county recorder versus the transfer being complete when the seller transfers the deed to the buyer. That would avoid the buyer who hides by holding the deed until having a new buyer. Anybody want to take a shot at that? Or Director Martin, do you have, I see you're shaking your head. Yes, I just wondered what you were thinking.
We've been talking about this in the VAPAC tax working group for some time. And I think it's a really important point because the more we try to curb these buyers, the more they may actually try to hide the fact that they're in the chain of title. So I think Ron's making an important point here that is important to be raised to you, senators, for your awareness.
Do you mind if I, oops,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, I got to turn on.
We're waiting for Ron O'Leary's former housing court judge and former director of building and housing in Cleveland, and currently works with the Cuyahoga County. Ron, are you able to pose that question a little more clearly if you want?
Yeah, sorry. So we have two computers on. Jen's using hers, I'm using mine. So sorry about the feedback. So, realizing that's upending several hundred years of real property law. But, when I used to be in Sally's position, we would have issues where what investors would do is they would buy a property, relatively inexpensively, and then hold it until they had another buyer. So in essence, they were just flipping the property, but they didn't want to be in the chain of title for very long because then code enforcement officials could come after them. So if the law was changed to basically make it so that that property transfers were effective upon filing with the recorder, it would take away a lot of that incentive to hide. And the basic, presumption was that somebody wants to file the deed as soon as possible, because if not, someone else could file another deed. I mean, you could get an unscrupulous seller that sells to multiple people. So it's one thought. How Cleveland, one way that Cleveland dealt with it was for code violations, essentially put in place something that mirrored CERCLA, so that anyone in the chain of title was responsible for demo and board up costs. So that could possibly be something, Senator, if you would think about on taking what we've done in Cleveland as a model and looking at it on a statewide basis. That could be helpful to other parts of the state.
Well, I think there are no further questions, and I think we are, well, oh, I see that somebody's going to start printing Super Sally t-shirts. Anyway, so I think we should probably wrap this up because we're a little bit behind, but not too badly. The Senator, thank you so much for participating with us today, and actually look forward to continue to working with you. Absolutely.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And thank you to all the panelists. Very helpful to have all of you giving your perspectives. And I'm going to, let's see, turn it back, or is there a break?